My name is Harper Chen Williams, and for 32 years, I believed I was living the perfect life. Growing up in the manicured suburbs of Willow Creek, California, I was what everyone called the golden daughter. My adoptive parents, Victoria and Richard Williams, owned the most successful real estate empire on the West Coast, and I was their carefully crafted success story, the Chinese orphan they rescued at age 6, who grew into their Harvard-educated, Fortune 500 company executive pride and joy. I thought I had hit the lottery when they chose me from that crowded orphanage in Shanghai. Victoria would always tell people at dinner parties how they fell in love with my determined little spirit the moment they saw me clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, refusing to let any of the other children touch it. She'd smile that practiced smile and say I was meant to be theirs, and I believed every word because what 6-year-old wouldn't want to believe they were chosen for love? But love, I discovered 3 decades later, comes in many disguises, and sometimes the most elaborate lies are wrapped in silk ribbons and trust funds. My life looked pristine from the outside. Penthouse apartment in downtown San Francisco, corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars, and a social circle filled with influential names that opened every door I ever wanted to walk through. I spoke perfect English with just the faintest trace of an accent that made people lean in closer at cocktail parties, as if my story was something exotic they could consume along with their champagne. Victoria had enrolled me in the best schools, hired private tutors to polish away any rough edges, and made sure I understood that excellence wasn't just expected. It was the price of belonging to their world. The Williams family had a reputation to maintain, and I was both their greatest achievement and their most carefully guarded secret. Richard would introduce me as our daughter Harper, with the same tone he used to show off his vintage Porsche collection. Proud, possessive, but always with an underlying reminder that I was something he had acquired, improved, and now displayed. Victoria was more subtle, but no less controlling. She'd correct my posture in public with a gentle hand on my back, whisper reminders about which fork to use at formal dinners, and had an uncanny ability to anticipate my every move before I made it. "Harper, darling, you'll want to network with the Peterson family tonight," she'd say, already steering me toward their table before I'd even finished scanning the room. It felt like guidance, like love, like the kind of parental investment every child dreams of receiving. The thing about being the perfect daughter is that perfection becomes your prison, without you even realizing the bars are there. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School because Victoria had mapped out my career path before I turned 16. I landed my first executive position at Morrison & Associates because Richard had golf relationships with half the board members. I lived in the penthouse because it came with the family business empire I was being groomed to inherit. Every success felt earned but orchestrated, every achievement mine but somehow also theirs. When people asked me about my dreams, I would recite the 5-year plan Victoria had helped me create, complete with quarterly benchmarks and growth projections. When they asked about my heritage, I would share the sanitized version of my origin story that painted my adoptive parents as heroes, and me as the grateful recipient of their generosity. But perfection is exhausting, and gratitude can become a heavy burden when it's the foundation of your entire identity. There were moments, usually late at night, when the city lights blurred through my floor-to-ceiling windows, when I felt like I was living someone else's life in someone else's body. I had everything I was supposed to want, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was constantly performing, constantly proving I deserved the life they had given me. Victoria would call these my melancholy moods and suggest I book a session with Dr. Morrison, their family therapist who specialized in adjustment issues for high-achieving adoptees. The sessions always ended the same way, with reassurances that my feelings were normal, that every successful person questions their path, and that I should focus on gratitude for the opportunities I'd been given. The first crack in my perfect life appeared 6 months ago, during what should have been a routine business dinner. Victoria had arranged for me to meet with the Blackwood family, old-money real estate moguls from Portland, who were considering a partnership with our firm. Eleanor Blackwood was exactly the kind of woman Victoria wanted me to emulate. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from generations of inherited wealth. We were discussing property developments over $70 stakes when she mentioned her daughter's recent work with international adoption agencies, specifically their efforts to reunite adult adoptees with their birth families in Asia. "The technology is remarkable now," Eleanor said, cutting into her fillet with surgical precision. DNA testing, digital record searches, international databases. Some of these children were taken under questionable circumstances, sold to agencies that falsified paperwork. It's quite shocking, really, how easily a child can disappear from one life and reappear in another with completely fabricated documentation. Something cold settled in my stomach as she spoke, but I maintained my professional smile and asked polite follow-up questions. Victoria's fork never paused in its journey to her mouth, but I noticed her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Eleanor continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension she was creating. My daughter worked on a case just last year. A young woman in her 20s discovered her adoption papers were entirely forged. Turns out she wasn't an orphan at all. Her birth parents had been told she died in a hospital fire, but she'd actually been sold to an American couple who paid over $200,000 through a black market adoption ring. The whole thing was orchestrated by corrupt officials who pocketed the money and destroyed the records. Can you imagine discovering that your entire life was built on someone else's crime? I couldn't finish my dinner. The expensive steak felt like cardboard in my mouth, and every sip of wine tasted bitter. Victoria excused us early, claiming I was coming down with something, and we rode home in unusual silence. But that night, alone in my pristine apartment, Eleanor's words echoed in my head like a warning bell I couldn't silence. I found myself staring at the framed photo on my nightstand, the only picture I had from before my adoption. 6-year-old me in a gray orphanage uniform, clutching that stuffed rabbit, looking directly into the camera with an expression I'd always interpreted as hope, but now recognized as fear. For the first time in decades, I wondered what had happened to that little girl's real parents, and why a 6-year-old who supposedly had no family would be so desperately protective of a toy that, I now realized, might have been the only connection she had to a life that had been erased. The obsession started innocently enough. I told myself I was just curious, that successful people should understand their origins, that knowing my history would help me appreciate my present even more. I started with simple Google searches during my lunch breaks. Shanghai Orphanages 1992, International Adoption China, Finding Birth Parents. The searches led me down rabbit holes of adoption forums, reunion stories, and gradually, more disturbing accounts of corruption in international adoption systems. Women shared stories of children who weren't actually orphans, of families torn apart by poverty and desperation, of American couples who paid premium prices for healthy babies without asking too many questions about where those babies came from. I created anonymous accounts on adoption reunion websites and spent hours reading testimonials from people who had discovered their adoptions were fraudulent. The stories had eerie similarities: missing or obviously falsified paperwork, adoption agencies that had mysteriously closed or changed names, adoptive parents who became defensive or evasive when questioned about the details of the process. One woman named Jennifer described how she'd discovered her birth certificate was completely fabricated, her supposed orphan status invented to facilitate an illegal sale to American buyers who paid $50,000 for what they believed was a legal adoption. Another man detailed how he'd found his birth parents still alive in rural China, devastated by the loss of their son who they'd been told had died of pneumonia, when in reality, he'd been sold to meet the demand for healthy male children in the American adoption market. The more I read, the more details of my own adoption started to seem questionable. Victoria had always been vague about the specifics, saying only that the process had been complicated but worth every penny, and that they'd worked with the most reputable agency money could buy. When I was younger and asked about my birth parents, she would get a distant look in her eyes and say they had died in a factory fire, that I was lucky to have survived because I hadn't been with them that day. It was a tragic but clean story, the kind that invited sympathy but discouraged further questions. Richard's version was slightly different. Sometimes it was a factory fire, sometimes a building collapse. Once he mentioned a car accident before catching himself and returning to the fire narrative. I decided to request my adoption files from the agency Victoria had mentioned, Harmony International Children's Services. When I called their headquarters in Los Angeles, the receptionist informed me that Harmony had ceased operations in 2003 following an FBI investigation, and their records had been sealed by court order. She suggested I contact the Department of Children and Family Services, but when I tried that route, I was told that records from private international agencies were often incomplete or had been destroyed during the transition when the companies folded. It felt like every door I tried to open led to another locked room, and the more obstacles I encountered, the more determined I became to find answers. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Rodriguez, a former federal agent who specialized in international adoption fraud cases. Marcus was blunt from our first meeting. If your adoption was legitimate, the paperwork would be easy to verify. The fact that it's not suggests one of two possibilities. Either the agency was cutting corners to expedite the process, or they were operating a black market adoption ring disguised as legitimate services. He explained that during the 1990s, the demand for adoptable children in America far exceeded the supply of actual orphans, creating a lucrative market for agencies that were willing to bend or break the rules. Children were sometimes purchased from desperately poor families who were told their kids would receive an education and return home, but instead were processed through fake orphanages and sold to American couples for tens of thousands of dollars. Marcus's investigation took 3 weeks, and what he uncovered made my blood run cold. Harmony International Children's Services had been shut down not for paperwork violations, but for operating a systematic child trafficking operation that generated over $15 million between 1988 and 2003. The agency had partnerships with corrupt officials in 6 countries who facilitated the removal of children from their families through forged death certificates, fake abandonment papers, and fabricated orphan documentation. The children were then processed through a network of facilities that looked like legitimate orphanages, but were actually holding centers where kids were prepared for international adoption. The preparation involved new names, new backstories, and in some cases, coaching to help the children play the part of grateful orphans who were eager for American families. But the most devastating discovery was in the financial records Marcus had obtained through his law enforcement connections. Richard and Victoria Williams had paid Harmony International exactly $247,000 for my adoption in 1992, nearly 10 times the cost of a legitimate international adoption at that time. The payment breakdown showed $180,000 for expedited processing and documentation, $45,000 for medical care and preparation, and $22,000 for translation services and cultural transition support. These weren't the fees of people adopting an orphan out of compassion. These were the prices paid by wealthy Americans who wanted to purchase a specific type of child and were willing to pay premium rates to avoid inconvenient questions or waiting periods. Marcus also found evidence that Richard had made additional payments to Harmony over the years. $15,000 in 1995, $30,000 in 1998, and $25,000 in 2001. The payment descriptions were vague, labeled as consultation fees and documentation updates, but Marcus's experience told him these were likely blackmail payments. Agencies like Harmony often maintained relationships with their clients long after the adoptions were finalized, using the threat of exposure to extract ongoing payments from families who had participated in illegal adoptions. The families couldn't report the extortion without admitting their own crimes, creating a perfect system of mutually assured destruction that kept everyone quiet for decades. The final piece of evidence was a document Marcus had obtained from the FBI files before they were sealed. A list of children who had been trafficked through Harmony's network, including their original names, ages, and locations where they had been taken. My name wasn't on the list, but there was an entry for a 6-year-old girl named Chen Li-Ming, taken from Guangzhou in 1992, described as healthy female, intelligent, compliant temperament, suitable for high-end placement. The age matched, the description matched, and Guangzhou was only 2 hours from Shanghai. When I saw that entry, something inside me shifted. I wasn't Harper Chen Williams, the grateful adopted daughter who had won life's lottery. I was Li-Ming Chen, a stolen child whose real parents might still be wondering what happened to their daughter 32 years ago. I chose Thanksgiving dinner to destroy their lives, and I chose it deliberately. Victoria had always made Thanksgiving her personal stage. The perfectly set table with her grandmother's china, the artfully arranged autumn centerpiece, the menu planned months in advance to impress whatever business associates or family friends she decided were important enough to include in our intimate family celebration. This year's guest list included the Morrison family, whose investment firm managed the Williams portfolio, and the Ashfords, whose construction company had exclusive contracts for all our residential developments. It was Victoria's favorite kind of evening, an opportunity to showcase her perfect family, her perfectly decorated home, and her perfectly curated life. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, wearing the navy Armani dress Victoria had bought me for such occasions, carrying a bottle of the expensive French wine Richard preferred, playing my role as the dutiful daughter one last time. The house looked like a magazine spread, all warm lighting and tasteful seasonal decorations, the kind of wealthy family tableau that Victoria had spent decades perfecting. She kissed my cheek and whispered that I looked lovely, then immediately launched into her hostess routine, ensuring everyone had drinks, guiding conversation topics, orchestrating the evening with the precision of a theater director. Richard held court in his leather chair, sharing carefully edited stories from his latest golf tournament, while our guests nodded and laughed at all the appropriate moments. During cocktails, I played my part perfectly. I asked Evelyn Morrison about her daughter's upcoming wedding, complimented James Ashford on his recent business expansion, and made charming small talk about my latest projects at the firm. Victoria beamed with pride as she watched me navigate the social dynamics she had trained me to handle, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as our guests clearly approved of how well-mannered and accomplished her adopted daughter had become. "Harper is just such a blessing to us," Victoria told Evelyn, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine maternal love. "We couldn't have asked for a better daughter. Sometimes I think the universe knew exactly what it was doing when it brought her into our lives." Dinner proceeded flawlessly through the first 3 courses. The turkey was perfectly golden, the wine pairings were expertly chosen, and the conversation flowed smoothly between business updates, vacation plans, and gentle gossip about mutual acquaintances. I waited until Victoria had finished telling the story of my first Thanksgiving with them, the tale of how a frightened 6-year-old had gradually learned to trust her new family, how patient and loving they had been as I adjusted to American customs, how grateful I remained for the opportunity they had given me to build a successful life in America. The guests smiled indulgently, clearly moved by the heartwarming narrative of cross-cultural adoption and family love. That's when I stood up, raised my wine glass, and said, "I'd like to propose a toast." The table fell quiet, all eyes focused on me with expectant smiles. Victoria looked pleased, probably assuming I was about to deliver some touching tribute to their parenting or my gratitude for their generosity. "To Victoria and Richard Williams," I began, my voice steady and clear, "who taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about the choices we make and the prices we're willing to pay for the lives we want to live." The guests murmured approval, raising their glasses. Victoria's smile grew wider, and Richard nodded approvingly at what seemed like an appropriately sentimental sentiment. "They taught me that love comes in many forms," I continued, "including the love that's willing to pay $247,000 to Harmony International Children's Services to purchase a 6-year-old girl named Chen Li Ming from a child trafficking operation that was later shut down by the FBI for selling stolen children to wealthy American families." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I watched as the color drained from Victoria's face. Richard's wineglass stopped halfway to his lips, his hand frozen in midair. The guests looked confused, glancing between each other and their hosts, trying to process what they had just heard. "I want to thank them for teaching me that documentation can be falsified, that orphans can be manufactured, and that desperate parents in China can be told their children died in factory fires, while those same children are being groomed in fake orphanages to become grateful adoptees for American families who don't ask inconvenient questions about where their purchased children actually came from." Victoria started to stand, her mouth opening to speak, but I held up my hand. "Please let me finish. This is my toast, after all." I turned to face our guests directly, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. "I also learned that when you base your entire life on a lie, you have to keep paying to maintain that lie." Richard here made additional payments to Harmony International throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, what we might call blackmail payments to keep them quiet about the illegal nature of my adoption. Because it turns out that successfully trafficking a child involves ongoing costs, not just the initial purchase price. James Ashford was the first to set down his wineglass and push back from the table. His wife Eleanor was already reaching for her purse, her face pale with embarrassment. The Morrison family sat frozen, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing the collapse of a carefully maintained facade and wanting no part of the destruction. "Harper," Richard finally found his voice, but it came out weak and strangled. "You don't understand the situation. You're misinterpreting." "I understand perfectly," I cut him off. "I understand that my real name is Chen Li Ming, that my parents weren't dead factory workers, and that you participated in a criminal conspiracy to steal me from my actual family and rebrand me as your grateful adopted daughter. I understand that for 32 years, I've been living a life built on kidnapping, fraud, and human trafficking, and I understand that tonight, everyone at this table knows exactly who you really are. The dinner party ended in a chaos of mumbled excuses and hurried departures. Victoria tried to salvage the situation by suggesting we all move to the living room and pretend my revelation had been some sort of stress-induced breakdown, but our guests were already gathering their coats and making awkward apologies about early morning commitments. The Morrison and Ashford families couldn't get out of that house fast enough, and I knew that by tomorrow morning, Victoria's carefully maintained social reputation would be in ruins. The story would spread through their elite social circle like wildfire. Whispered conversations over country club lunches, shocked phone calls between tennis partners, the kind of scandal that permanently destroys the social standing that wealthy families spend generations building. After the last guest left, we sat in the dining room surrounded by the remnants of Victoria's perfect Thanksgiving dinner, the expensive china and crystal now looking like evidence at a crime scene. Victoria stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, while Richard paced behind his chair, like a caged animal. The silence stretched for several minutes before Victoria finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known?" she asked, not looking up at me. When I told her about Marcus's investigation and what we had discovered, she nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment for decades. "We never meant for it to be permanent," she said. "We thought we would tell you when you were older, when you could understand the complexities of the situation." Richard stopped pacing and turned to face me, his businessman facade cracking to reveal something desperate underneath. "You have to understand, Harper. Li Ming, we saved you from a life of poverty. Your birth parents couldn't feed you, couldn't educate you, couldn't give you any of the opportunities you've had. We gave you everything, the best schools, the best clothes, a trust fund, a career, a future. We loved you as much as any biological parent could love a child." His voice broke as he spoke, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "The money we paid wasn't for buying a child. It was for saving one. It was for giving you a chance at the American dream. But I was done being grateful for my stolen life." "You didn't save me," I said, standing up from the table. "You bought me. You paid $250,000 to participate in a child trafficking operation, and then you spent 32 years convincing me that I should be thankful for the privilege of being your purchased daughter. You stole me from my real family, gave me a fabricated identity, and built your entire reputation on the lie that you were generous people who adopted an orphan out of the goodness of your hearts." I picked up the folder Marcus had prepared with all the evidence of their crimes. "But the really sick part is that you made me complicit in my own trafficking by teaching me to be grateful for it." Victoria finally looked up at me, her eyes red with tears. "What are you going to do?" she asked, and I could hear 32 years of control dissolving in her voice. She was no longer the poised society matron who had orchestrated every aspect of my life. She was just a terrified woman who knew her world was about to collapse. "The statute of limitations," Richard started to say, but I cut him off. "There's no statute of limitations on what you did to me," I told him. "And there's definitely no statute of limitations on what I'm going to do to you." Marcus had helped me prepare for this moment. While there might not be criminal charges available for crimes committed so long ago, there were other ways to ensure justice. I had already contacted the FBI's Human Trafficking Division and provided them with all the evidence Marcus had gathered. They were reopening the investigation into Harmony International and pursuing civil rights violations charges that could result in significant financial penalties and potential deportation proceedings, since Richard and Victoria had lied on their citizenship applications about their involvement in criminal activities. But more importantly, I had contacted a journalist named Sarah Chen at the San Francisco Chronicle, who specialized in international adoption fraud stories. Sarah was planning a major expose on wealthy American families who had participated in child trafficking operations during the 1990s, and the Williams family was going to be her featured case study. The article would include financial records, FBI documents, interviews with other victims of the Harmony International trafficking ring, and my personal account of growing up as an unwitting victim of human trafficking. It would run in the Sunday edition with front-page placement, and Sarah had already arranged for follow-up interviews with national news networks. I also had a surprise that I had been saving for last. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had helped me contact the Chinese authorities and initiate a search for my real parents. Using the information from the FBI files and DNA testing through international databases, we had located Chen Wei-ming and Li Xiaohui in Guangzhou, my father and mother, now in their 60s, who had spent 32 years believing their daughter had died in childhood. They had never stopped mourning Li Ming, had kept my room exactly as it was when I disappeared, and had lit incense for my spirit every year, on the anniversary of my supposed death. Through a translator, they had agreed to speak with me via video call, and that conversation was scheduled for tomorrow morning. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to see my real parents, hear my birth name spoken by the people who gave it to me, and begin the process of reclaiming the identity that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to defend myself. Victoria and Richard would not be part of that conversation, would not be welcome in any part of my future, and would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of their crimes while I built a new life based on truth instead of lies. As I walked toward the door, Victoria called after me one last time. "Harper, please. We do love you. That was never a lie." I stopped and turned back to look at her, this woman who had shaped my entire existence through deception and manipulation. "My name is Li Ming," I said, "and you love the child you bought and molded into your perfect daughter. You have no idea who I actually am, because you never bothered to find out. You erased that person before she had a chance to exist." The front door closed behind me with a satisfying click, and I walked out into the California evening air feeling lighter than I had in 32 years. Tomorrow, the Williams family would wake up to find their names in the newspaper associated with child trafficking and international fraud. Their business would face federal investigations, their social standing would be destroyed, and their carefully constructed life would crumble under the weight of their crimes. But tonight, Li Ming Chen was finally free, and she was ready to discover who she had always been meant to be. The inheritance they had planned to leave me would instead be frozen by federal authorities as proceeds from criminal activity. The trust fund they had established in my name would be investigated as money laundering. The life they had built for themselves would be dismantled piece by piece, just as they had dismantled mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt like justice wasn't just a concept rich people used to control poor people. It was something that could actually reach up and pull down those who thought their money and status made them untouchable. Did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.